What's your favorite oops, I just really fucked up moment? I was a brand new, right out of college, computer programmer back before we had Shio software developers. We worked on mini computers at the time, and I had a long process that I needed to run which tied up my terminal. I went into the storage closet and dragged out another terminal so that I could do stuff while the process ran. An old version of multi-taking. You kids have no idea how easy you have it nowadays. Well, because the new kid had two terminals, none of the other programmers wanted to look less productive, so everyone else did that. Then a week or so later, the president of the company came back to the programmer area so he could mess around with some new hardware that came in. He looked around and said, "Looks like everybody has two terminals now." Being a smartass, I quickly quipped, "Well, we all have two hands," which was met with silence. Usually, my quips get at least a chuckle. It was then that I remembered that the president of the company did not, in fact, have two hands. He had a birth defect and one did not develop properly. My brother tells a tale of woe about the day his college GF was obviously just itching for a fight. They were hanging out when she complained about the weight she'd gained. He said he hadn't noticed. She called him a liar. He maintained that he hadn't noticed. Finally, she said, "Dude, I'm exactly 5 feet tall and I've gone from 100 blobbies to 110. That's like 20 albiabas on a regular sized person. How could you not notice? Either you're lying or you don't notice me at all. So which is it?" So bro finally and reluctantly said, "I guess I can see it a little, but you look She immediately interrupted with, "Oh my God, I can't believe you just called me fat." This led to the biggest fight they'd ever had until their eventual breakup a full 2 years later. It was back in my school days when I was around 12 or 13. We had an exam and I didn't pass it because I was too lazy to study, like most of the time. But this time, I actually failed. On the day I got the exam back, I just put it in my backpack and went home. My mom knew I had a test the week before, so she asked me if I'd received the results. Since it was a Friday, I told her, no, not yet, because I wanted to enjoy a nice weekend. She didn't ask any further, so I dropped my bag in my room and had an amazing Friday. The next day, I went out grocery shopping or something like that with my dad while my mom stayed home to prepare lunch. While she was in the kitchen, she also decided to turn on the dishwasher and went looking for the lunchbox she'd given me for school. It was in my backpack. While looking for the lunchbox, she also found the failed exam. Well, I think you can all imagine how thrilled my mom was when I came back home with my dad. Somehow, when I was in high school, late 90s, everyone who still lived at home at the time had water beds, which made moving into a new house a bit of a pain in the ass. I remember getting all of the beds set up and having the garden hose in the last one to fill it up. While this is happening, the van with the rest of the house in it arrived and everyone goes to start unloading. No one is watching this last waterbed fill. Several hours later over pizza, my sister comes into the kitchen and says that the carpet in the hallway is wet, and we all had a collective, really fucked up moment. The bed had overfilled to the point that the fill nozzle was like 3 feet over the sides of the frame. The mattress was horribly stretched, the hose had detached and was just dumping onto the floor. It took several hours to shop vac the water out of the carpet, but we were able to deflate and salvage the mattress at least. Wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's one that haunts me the most. When I was in college, I went to a computer in the school library. They were on these big circular desks with computers all around. It was morning, so I was kind of tired. Some people were on the computers working already. And me being kind of tired still, I sat there, got on a computer, and then I stretched my arms and then stretched my legs out. And unfortunately, the power strip for the computers was near me on my side, and my foot hit the button on the power strip and turned off all the computers on that desk. I don't remember what she looked like, but I still remember the kind of look of quiet anger and frustration of this girl that was working on a paper. Just suddenly lose all of her work. She just quietly got up and walked away. I would have felt better if she just stood up and punched me in the face. As a teenager in the early 2000s, I had a sweet little job. Large commercial cargo vessels were being built in my town. When the vessel is nearly complete, there is always someone on board to keep curious people and such away from the vessel. In the weekends, that was me. I just needed to stay in the harbor on the vessel for 36H, that's all. I was allowed to bring one friend, and I was allowed to make use of nearly everything the vessel has to offer. New vessel again, and one evening I was a bit bored, so I went on a little exploration on this huge cargo vessel. I found the machine room. I was amazed by the massive engines and all the other equipment. I found what I thought was deodorant spray. I sprayed some in the air. Doesn't smell like anything? Let's spray some more. Suddenly, the fire alarms went off. I looked at the bottle. It said something fire alarm tester. I didn't know how to turn everything off. I tried calling my boss, but he didn't pick up late in the evening. Before I knew it, there were like 5 fire engines next to me in the harbor. Oops. When I was 19, I was driving my dad's Cherokee in the woods on a 2-track. It wasn't anything too wild, and I knew the way, but I unfortunately hit a stick or a stub or something that popped the tire instantly. I hopped out and looked for a spare, but there wasn't one under the trunk cover. It may have been suspended under the chassis, but I didn't know to look there. I had to call my sick mom and wake her up so she could come pick me and my GF up out of the woods. Had to leave the Jeep sitting there. The next day I rode with our mechanic down the trail so he could tow it out. He had to hop out and use a hatchet to cut out a small tree that was blocking the way of his tall tow truck. He almost threw out his back. I felt like shit just watching him. The tire pop was an accident, but the lesson learned that day was make sure you have a spare and know how to change it. Edit. I didn't find a jack either, which made me think there was no spare anywhere. My dad bought it with beefy aftermarket tires, and I'm assuming whoever put those on was too cheap to buy a 5th spare tire. A few years ago, I was working at an HMV online warehouse back when CDs and DVDs were still a thing. We had this persistent issue that had been dragging on for months. At one point, some big bosses came for a visit, including the CEO of the entire company. During the visit, one of the floor staff decided to ask the CEO about the issue in front of the entire workforce. He played along and said he'd look into it, which we all knew was unlikely since it was so far below his pay grade. Fast forward a few weeks, and I was sending yet another email about the same issue. Half jokingly, I added, as CEO's name said he would look into it. The problem? I wasn't 100% sure how to spell his name. So I started typing it into the CC field to let it auto-populate, thinking I'd delete it after. Except I didn't. I hit send. So now the CEO had an email from some nobody 75 levels below him, looking like I was whining and holding him personally accountable for an issue he definitely didn't need to deal with. I imagine he opened that email like, who the hell is this guy? Thankfully, my manager was an absolute legend. After laughing his head off at my expense, he smoothed things over by sending an apology email on my behalf. I'm getting a hot neck just thinking about it. I used to work the receiving dock and knew all the truck drivers. One was Bob, 6'6" and built like an NFL player. I transferred to the second plant about 4 miles down the road, and it was mostly new hires who didn't know me or that I used to work receiving. One day Bob shows up because his load needed to be dropped at the second plant. It was just about lunchtime, so he said he would wait. A bunch of us and Bob went to the bathroom to wash up for lunch. Bob sighed, and I said, cheer up, it could be worse. It already is. My wife thinks she is pregnant. Without hesitation, I replied, so, is it yours? Everyone in the room had eyes, and they were all thinking this guy has done fucked up and is about to be beaten to death. Bob just looked at me and said, yeah, that was the first thing I asked her. So when I was in school, gay was a very popular word to describe things. Most people here will know what I mean when I say it was never said with the intent of, oh, that is homosexual, more of a, oh, that's annoying thing. Not that it makes the use of the word any better, but the intent when I say it is important here. Me and one friend thought we were peak hilarious when we swapped out gay for lesbian when we'd speak like that, peak 13, 14-year-old humor. Anyway, one day, I was in an argument with my older sister. We'd both used the word gay in the way I described growing up, so in the heat of the moment I went to say, oh, shut up gay, jokingly, and instead said, oh, shut up lesbian, with a bit more venom in the word than I anticipated. My sister was in a relationship with another woman at the time. Absolute instant regret and horror when I said it. Shock on her face, too. Instantly ends the conversation. It's one of those things that just creeps back into your head every couple months. I eventually brought it up a year or two back, and she says she has no memory of it, and it's hilarious. That shit stewed in my mind for years, and she didn't care. The bastard. On my first day at a new job, I was assigned the task of adding a user to an SFTP connection, something I'd done before without any issues. Confidently, I created the user and everything seemed fine, but when I went to test it, the website was completely gone. It turned out that the new user directory I created had overwritten the main folder where the website was stored. Everything had been wiped out. I panicked and immediately called GoDaddy. Thankfully, they had a backup in place, and the site was fully restored within a couple of hours. Lesson learned. Oops. I grew up in a religious and extremely strict house. I was not really ever allowed to hang out or sleep over at people's houses. When I was 16, I made a friend at work and was allowed to hang out with her almost daily, despite my mother not liking her. One day, we started experimenting with me sneaking out to go on adventures with them. They didn't have to sneak out because their parents were awesome. I have two stories from this time period. One night, I snuck out at around 10 p.m. after my parents had gone to sleep. At around 10:30, I started to get a weird feeling and asked my friend to drive me home. As I was walking around the back of my house, our normal entrance, I heard the door click locked. My father had woken up and double-checked the locks for no reason, locking me out. I stood there for a minute, panicking before accepting my fate. I knocked on the door, he looked at me and said, "Where the fuck were you?" To which I replied, "I was looking at the stars from the front porch and I fell asleep." He bought that one. A few weeks later, I snuck out again. It was winter and we were pulling people behind my friend's car at the quarry in town. It was one of our favorite activities and everyone had a lot of fun, no real injuries. It was 1 a.m. when her 94 Geoprism got stuck on some ice and none of us could get it moving. We had to call her dad and woke her whole family up. He came and picked us up in silence. Luckily, because he knew my mom was abusive, he dropped me at the top of the street and told me to stop making risky choices while I lived at home. Anyway, 16 was a good year. Went outside late one night to smoke a joint in high school, parents asleep, both having to work early the next morning. Got too high and was just on zombie autopilot going back into the house. Rang my own doorbell for some reason, not thinking about it. Heard the sound from inside and instantly snapped back to reality, realizing what I had just done. Dad comes to the door in underwear with a gun and isn't happy to see my high ass. Got grounded for a while, but I still crack up trying to figure out what I was thinking at the time. The peaceful nighttime outside high went out the window so fast as soon as I pushed the button, leaving me in a stupor of oops, I just really fucked up. Totally low stakes, but I find it funny now. Foreign language spoken final exam. We were specifically instructed not to lie. I was horrible at this language. My professor was well aware that I was horrible at it. I was asked if I had ever been to a country that natively speaks this language. I was so bad I confused the words for yes and no, and as a result, I said yes. I had never been there. My professor was from there, spent the whole rest of the time using the very few simple words and sentences I did remember to lie about what it was like in the country I had never been to. My brain likes to revisit that lovely final exam from time to time, and I just have a little giggle about how awkward it was. How hard is it to remember the words for yes and no? Also, ever try lying in a foreign language you can barely grasp?